Imagine you are a criminal investigator in the United States during the early 1970s. A university student leaves home for what should have been an ordinary day. She tells her family she'll be back soon. Friends expect to see her later in that evening, but she never arrives. At first, it seems like an isolated missing person case, something every police department unfortunately encounters from time to time. Officers begin asking questions, searching nearby areas, interviewing friends and family, and hoping that perhaps she simply left voluntarily or would soon return. Then, only a short time later, another young woman disappears, then another. Soon, communities begin asking the same troubling question. Are these unrelated incidents, or is someone deliberately targeting young women? Welcome to this case study on Ted Bundy. Before we begin, it's important to understand that this video is not intended to glorify crime or sensationalize violence. Every victim in this case was a real person with dreams, ambition, and loved ones whose lives were forever changed. Our purpose is different. Together, we are going to examine this case through the lens of criminology, forensic science, investigative methods, and behavioral analysis. Rather than asking only what happened, we will ask how investigators uncovered the truth, what challenges they faced, and what lasting lessons this investigation continues to teach law enforcement around the world. Cases like this remain in criminology textbooks not because of the offender, but because they transform investigative practices. They challenge existing policing methods, highlighted the importance of cooperation between agencies, and demonstrated how understanding behavior can assist in solving complex crimes. By the end of this documentary, I hope you will see this case not as another true crime story, but as a powerful example of how science, investigation, and critical thinking work together in the pursuit of justice. To truly appreciate why this investigation became so difficult, we first need to step back in time. Imagine living in the early 1970s. There were no smartphones to record moments, no GPS to track locations, and no social media where missing person alerts could spread instantly to millions of people. Surveillance cameras were rare, especially in public parks, university campuses, and recreational areas. DNA profiling, which today has solved countless criminal cases, had not yet been introduced into criminal investigations. Even computers played only a very limited role in police work. Instead, investigations relied heavily on people. Detectives interviewed witnesses face to face, took handwritten notes, compared physical evidences manually, and searched through stacks of paper records stored in filing cabinets. Communication between police departments was much slower than it is today. If investigators in one state discovered information that might be useful to officers in another state, it often required phone cells, mailed reports, or formal meetings that information could be shared. Now imagine a series of disappearances occurring across different cities and eventually across different states. Each police department initially sees only its own investigation. No one can immediately compare hundreds of reports with a single click. Patterns that might seem obvious today could remain hidden for weeks or even months. This historical context is crucial because it reminds us that investigators were not careless or unprepared. They were working with the best resources available at the time. Understanding those limitations helps us appreciate both the challenges they faced and the remarkable persistence required to solve complex cases before the digital age transformed criminal investigations. As more missing person reports arrived, detectives began noticing similarities that could no longer be ignored. Individually, each disappearance appeared unique. Different victims had disappeared from different locations under different circumstances. Yet, when investigators started comparing reports side by side, subtle connections began to emerge. Several victims were young women, many were students or had recently visited the university campuses or public recreational areas. Witnesses in different locations described encountering a polite young man who appeared approachable and well spoken. Some remembered him wearing what looked like a sling on his arm or pretending to have an injury. Others recalled him asking for assistance with carrying books or loading items into a vehicle. On their own, these details seemed ordinary. After all, helping an injured stranger is something many people would naturally do. But criminal investigations are built on patterns. Experienced detectives understand that the significance of a clue often depends not on how dramatic it appears but on how often it reappears. When multiple independent witnesses who had never met one another begin describing similar encounters, investigators take notice. This is one of the most important principles in criminology. A single observation rarely solved a case. Instead, investigators collect dozens or even hundreds of small observations, gradually assembling them like pieces of a puzzle. One witness remembers a vehicle, another remembers a conversation, a third remembers the time of the day. Individually, these details reveal very little. Together, they begin to tell a story. At this stage, detectives could still not say with certainty that one offender was responsible. Good investigations avoid jumping to conclusions. Instead, they ask careful questions. Could these disappearances be connected? Were investigators looking at a single offender, or were these merely tragic coincidences? Those questions would guide every decision made in the months that followed. One of the most valuable tools in any criminal investigation is a field known as victimology. Despite its importance, victimology is often misunderstood. It does not exist to judge victims or question their choices. Instead, it seeks to understand patterns that may help investigators identify how an offender selected victims and how future crimes might be prevented. Think of it this way: if investigators only study each victim separately, they may miss the larger picture. But when they compare cases, they begin asking important questions. Were the victims of a similar age? Did they share similar routines? Were they last seen in the comparable environments? Did they unknowingly encounter similar circumstances before disappearing? In this case, investigators noticed recurring characteristics among many victims. Several were young women attending university or involved in everyday activities such as walking through public areas, visiting parks, or traveling between familiar locations. These observations did not explain why each individual became a victim, but they helped investigators understand how the offender appeared to create opportunities. This distinction is extremely important. Criminologists never study victim patterns to assign blame. Responsibility for a crime always resets entirely with the offender. Instead, victimology provides investigators with valuable information that can improve public awareness, guide prevention strategies, and focus investigative efforts. Even today, victimology remains a cornerstone of criminal investigations around the world, whether examining cybercrime, financial fraud, or violent offenses. Understanding patterns among victims often helps investigators identify risk, recognize emerging trends, and ultimately protect future potential victims. By now, investigators had collected numerous missing person reports, interviewed countless witnesses, and begun identifying similarities that suggested the cases might be connected. Yet, suspicion alone is never enough. In criminal investigations, every conclusion must be supported by evidence. Imagine trying to solve a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle with most of the pieces still missing. You might recognize parts of the picture, but you cannot confidently say what the complete image looks like until more pieces fall into place. Investigations work in much the same way. Detectives may develop theories, but those theories must be tested, challenged, and supported by reliable evidence before they can form the basis of legal action. As public concern increased, so did pressure on law enforcement. Families demanded answers, communities became increasingly anxious, newspapers reported on the growing number of disappearances while rumors spread rapidly. Investigators found themselves balancing two equally important responsibilities: protecting the public while avoiding conclusions that were not yet supported by evidence. At this point, detectives understood they were no longer dealing with a series of isolated incidents. A larger investigation was taking shape. Cases that had once been scattered across different jurisdictions were gradually being weaved as part of a much broader picture. The focus now shifted from asking whether these disappearances were connected to determining how they were connected, who might be responsible, and most importantly, how those suspicions could be proven through evidence that would stand up in a court of law. This marked one of the most significant turning points in the investigation. The mystery was no longer simply about missing persons, it had become an extensive search for patterns, evidence, and the individual responsible. An investigation that would test the limits of policing in an era before modern forensic technology. By this stage of the investigation, detectives had reached a critical realization. Although each disappearance had originally been investigated as an independent case, the growing number of similarities could no longer be ignored. What had once appeared to be separate missing person reports now seemed to form the part of a much larger and more complex investigation. This was the moment when detectives began doing something that remains fundamental to criminal investigations today. They started comparing everything. They compared dates, they compared locations, they examined witness statements collected weeks apart by different police departments. They reviewed photographs, handwritten reports, maps, and interview records. Every detail, no matter how small, was placed side by side in an effort to answer one question: could all of these cases be connected? This process may sound straightforward, but in reality, it required an enormous amount of patience. There were no digital databases capable of instantly searching thousands of reports. Detectives worked with paper files, filing cabinets, physical maps, and handwritten notes. They often traveled between departments, exchanged documents by post, or spent hours discussing similarities over telephone conversation. One of the greatest strengths of experienced investigators is their ability to recognize patterns that others might overlook. They understand that solving a major case rarely depends on discovering one dramatic clue. Instead, it depends on recognizing how many seemingly insignificant clues fit together. Think of an experienced doctor diagnosing a patient. A single symptom may not reveal the illness, but when several symptoms are considered together, a clearer diagnosis begins to emerge. Criminal investigations operate in much the same way. Every witness statement, every location, every timeline, and every observation contributes another piece to the investigative puzzle. Gradually, detectives become increasingly confident that they were not facing multiple unrelated incidents. They were likely searching for one offender whose activities extended far beyond the boundaries of a single city or country. One of the biggest misconceptions created by television crime dramas is that investigations are solved by dramatic discoveries. A fingerprint appears, DNA produces an instant match, or a suspect suddenly confesses. Real investigations are rarely that simple. Most are built on ordinary details that initially seem unimportant. In this case, investigators carefully analyzed hundreds of witness statements. Some witnesses remembered seeing a particular vehicle, others recalled a brief conversation with a polite young man. A few noticed someone behaving unusually near public places where people later disappeared. Individually, none of these observations seemed extraordinary. In fact, many investigators initially believed they had little evidential value, but experienced detectives know something important. People may forget major events, yet they often remember unusual little details. Perhaps someone remembers the color of a car, another remembers a cast on someone's arm, someone else remembers the way a person spoke. When investigators combine independent observations from people who have never met each other, patterns begin to appear. This is known as corroboration. Corroboration means that information provided by one source is supported by evidence or testimony from another independent source. It is one of the cornerstones of criminal investigation. Notice that investigators were not searching for perfect evidence, they were searching for consistency. If 10 unrelated witnesses independently describe similar circumstances, investigators become increasingly confident that those observations deserve closer examination. This approach requires extraordinary patience. Detectives must separate reliable information from mistaken memories, rumors, assumptions, and public speculation. Every statement must be evaluated objectively. Every possibility must be tested. Good investigators do not simply collect information, they evaluate its reliability before allowing it to influence the direction of the investigation. To appreciate how remarkable this investigation was, we need to remember the era in which it formed. Today, investigators have access to tools that detectives in the 1970s could scarcely imagine. A missing person's movement may be reconstructed using mobile phone records. Vehicles can be identified through automatic license plate recognition. DNA recovered from tiny biological samples can identify individuals decades after a crime. Surveillance cameras record movements across cities. Digital banking record established timelines. Social media provides additional investigative leads. None of these resources existed during the early stages of this investigation. Instead, detectives relied upon traditional investigative methods. They physically searched forests, rivers, and remote locations. They interviewed families repeatedly. They revisited crime scene, reviewed handwritten reports. They manually compared fingerprints. They created timelines using paper calendars. Maps were spread across tables rather than computer screens. Imagine investigating multiple disappearances across several states without email, internet searches, or searchable databases. The workload was enormous, yet investigators persisted. This reminds us that successful investigations depend not only upon technology but also upon determination, organization, and critical thinking. Technology makes investigation faster, it does not replace the investigator. As more witnesses came forward, investigators began recognizing another opportunity. Several individuals had encountered a man shortly before victims disappeared. Although each witness remembered slightly different features, the description shared enough similarities to justify creating a composite sketch. A forensic artist met individually the witnesses. Rather than asking broad questions, the artist guided them carefully through individual facial characteristics, the shape of the eyes, the hairstyle, the nose, the jawline, the eyebrows. Each feature was refined until the witness felt it most closely matched their memory. The final sketch was never intended to be an exact portrait. Instead, it served as an investigative aid. It Its purpose was very simple. Someone somewhere might recognize the face. Composite sketches continue to be used today, although modern technology now allows investigators to produce digital facial reconstruction far more quickly. Nevertheless, the underlying principle remains unchanged. Witness memory is imperfect, therefore, sketches generate leads. They do not provide guilt. One of the greatest mistakes investigators can make is treating a sketch as conclusive evidence. Instead, it should encourage further investigation rather than replace it. This distinction reflects an essential principle of forensic science. Every investigative tool has strengths and also has limitations. Understanding both is what makes an investigation scientifically reliable. As investigators gathered more information, they began focusing not only on physical evidence but also on behavior. Behavioral evidences examines actions rather than identity. Instead of asking who committed the crime, investigators first ask what behaviors are consistently appearing. How did the offender approach people? Were similar methods used repeatedly? Did the location suggest familiarity? Were particular situations being exploited? Behavioral analysis is not fortune telling. It is not psychology based on assumptions. It is a careful study of observable actions. In this investigation, detectives recognized that the offender appeared to reduce suspicion through deception rather than immediate violence. Witness accounts suggested someone who appeared calm, polite, and trustworthy. Understanding these behavioral patterns allowed investigators to explain why victims might unwillingly interact with someone who appeared harmless. This illustrates an important criminological principle. Offenders often adapt their behavior to reduce resistance and avoid attracting attention. Recognizing these recurring behaviors help investigators compare separate offenses and identify links that physical evidence alone may not reveal. Behavior becomes another form of evidence, not evidence that proves guilt by itself, but evidence that guides investigators towards better questions. As public attention intensified, pressure on investigators increased dramatically. Families wanted answers, communities demanded arrests, newspapers published daily reports, rumors spread rapidly, tips flooded police departments. Among thousands of leads were reports mentioning a man named Theodore Robert Bundy. Some individuals recognized similarities between public descriptions and someone they knew. Others identified a vehicle that resembled one discussed during the investigation. At first glance, it might seem that investigators had finally found their suspect, but real investigations do not work that way. Receiving a name is not the same as proving involvement. Every lead must undergo the same careful evaluation. Investigators had to determine whether the information was credible. Did witness accounts support it? Could timeless be verified? Was there physical evidence connecting the individual to the crimes? Could independent evidence corroborate the information? These questions illustrate one of the most fundamental principles of criminal justice. Suspicion is not evidence. Public opinion is not evidence, and media attention is not evidence. Only carefully collected, objectively evaluated, legally admissible evidence can support criminal charges. This principle protects not only investigation but also justice itself. Throughout history, investigators have encountered countless suspects who initially appeared convincing but were ultimately eliminated through evidence. That is why professional investigators remain cautious. They test every theory, challenge every assumption, verify every claim. As this investigation continued, detectives gradually shifted from asking who might be responsible to a far more demanding questions: can we prove it? Because in criminal investigation, solving the mystery is only one part of the process. The real challenge is presenting evidence that is scientifically reliable, legally admissible, and strong enough to withstand examination in a court of law. Only then can an investigation truly fulfill its purpose, not merely identifying a suspect, but establishing the truth to evidence. As the investigation progressed, detectives gradually assembled enough evidence to bring Theodore Robert Bundy before the courts. It was not a single clue, a dramatic confession, or one breakthrough that solved the case. Instead, it was years of investigative work combining witness testimonies, physical evidence, forensic examinations, behavioral observations, and cooperation between different law enforcement agencies. Piece by piece, the evidence formed a clearer picture, eventually leading to convictions for several murders. From many people, this is where the story ends. The offender is identified, the trial concludes, justice is delivered. But if we stop here, we miss the most important part of the story. For criminologists and forensic scientists, the courtroom is not the end of the investigation, it is the beginning of understanding. Every major criminal case becomes a source of knowledge. It forces investigators to ask difficult questions. What worked well? What mistakes delayed the investigation? Which investigative methods proved effective? Which forensic techniques were reliable? How could similar crimes be detected earlier in the future? These questions are what transform a criminal case into a learning opportunity. The Ted Bundy investigation became one of the most influential criminal investigations in modern American history because it exposed weaknesses that law enforcement agencies had never fully recognized before. During the early stages of the investigation, different police departments were working independently. Each department focused only on the disappearances within its own jurisdiction. At first, there was no central system capable of connecting reports from different cities or states. Today, this may seem surprising. We live in a world where information can be shared almost instantly. A fingerprint entered into a database can be compared against millions of records within minutes. DNA profiles can be searched nationally. Missing persons reports are distributed almost immediately. Investigators can communicate with colleagues across the country in real time. But during the 1970s, none of these systems existed. The Bundy investigation demonstrated just how dangerous fragmented investigations could become. Criminals do not respect city boundaries, country lines, or state borders. If law enforcement agencies fail to communicate effectively, important patterns may remain hidden for months or even years. This investigation became one of the driving forces behind improving information sharing between agencies. It encouraged the development of better missing person coordination, stronger communication networks, and greater recognition that serial crimes often require cooperation far beyond a single police department. In many ways, the greatest legacy of this case is not the conviction itself, it is the transformation of investigative thinking. The most important disciplines within criminology is victimology, but unfortunately, it is also one of the most misunderstood. When people hear the term victimology, some mistakenly believe that investigators are trying to examine what victims did wrong. That is absolutely not the purpose of victimology. Victimology does not assign blame. Responsibility for a crime always belongs to the offender. Instead, victimology seeks to answer an entirely different questions. What can investigators learn from studying victim patterns? Every victim has a unique life, unique experiences, and unique circumstances. However, when investigators compare many cases together, they sometimes discover similarities that can reveal valuable investigative information. During this investigation, detectives carefully compared numerous factors. Were the victims of similar age? Did they have similar daily routines? Were they traveling alone? Did they disappear from similar types of locations? Did witnesses observe similar circumstances shortly before they disappeared? None of these questions were intended to judge the victims. Instead, they helped investigators understand how opportunities for offending appear to develop. Think about how epidemiologists investigate disease outbreaks. They study patterns. Where did infections occur? Who was affected? What similarities exist between different cases? The goal is not to blame patients. Their goal is to understand the disease so future outbreaks can be prevented. Victimology works in much the same way. It studies patterns so investigators can better understand risks and improve prevention. Today, victimology influences everything from campus safety programs and public awareness campaigns to missing person investigations and crime prevention strategies. Perhaps its greatest contribution is reminding investigators that behind every case file is a real human being whose life mattered. The purpose of studying victims is ultimately to protect future victims. As investigators analyzed the evidence, another important concept became relevant in criminology: the difference between modus operandi, often shortened to MO, and signature behavior. These two terms are frequently used interchangeably in movies and television, but in professional investigation, they mean very different things. A modus operandi refers to the practical methods an offender uses to commit an offense successfully while avoiding detection. Think of it as the offender's working method. It answers practical questions such as: how did the offender approach the victim? How was the offense carried out? How did the offender attempt to escape? Because these methods are practical rather than psychological, they often change over time. As offenders gain experience or encounter different situations, they may adapt their methods to reduce risk or increase efficiency. Whereas a signature behavior, however, serves a different purpose. It is not necessary for completing the offense. Instead, it reflects behaviors connected to the offender's personal psychological needs. Unlike the MO, which may change, signature behaviors tend to remain more consistent because they satisfy internal motivations rather than practical objectives. Understanding this difference is important for investigators. Now, just imagine two crimes that initially appeared different because the offender changed their method of approaching victims. If investigators focused only on the practical method, they might mistakenly conclude that different offenders were responsible. However, if deeper behavioral patterns remain consistent, investigators might recognize connections that would otherwise be missed. This is why behavioral science plays such an important role in modern investigation. It encourages investigators to examine not only physical evidence but also recurring patterns of human behavior. At the same time, responsible criminologists avoid making unsupported assumptions. Behavioral analysis should always be guided by documented evidence rather than speculation. Scientific investigation depends upon objectivity and not just imagination. When many people hear this phrase behavioral analysis, they immediately think of television programs where profilers enter a crime scene and somehow identify an offender's personality within minutes. Reality is far less dramatic and far more scientific. Behavioral analysis is not about reading minds, it is about studying observable actions. Investigators ask questions such as: how did the offender interact with victims? Were similar approaches used repeatedly? Did offenses occur under comparable circumstances? How much planning appears to have been involved? Did the offender demonstrate increasing confidence over time? Each answer helps investigator build a behavioral picture based on evidence rather than assumption. In this case, detectives recognized recurring behaviors that appeared across multiple investigations. Witnesses frequently describe someone who seemed very polite, calm, and approachable rather than creating immediate suspicion. The offender appeared capable of gaining trust before committing the offense. This behavioral consistency became another investigative clue. It did not identify the offender on its own, it did not replace forensic evidence. Instead, it complemented another investigative findings. One of the greatest strengths of behavioral analysis is that it encourages investigators to think beyond individual incidents. Instead of asking what happened in this one case, they begin asking, does this behavior appear elsewhere? This shift in thinking has become fundamental to modern serial crime investigations. Today, behavioral analysis works alongside forensic pathology, DNA analysis, digital forensics, crime scene reconstruction, and victimology as a part of a multidisciplinary investigative approach. No single discipline solves major investigations independently. The strongest investigations combine scientific evidence, behavioral observations, careful documentation, witness testimony, and professional collaboration. That is perhaps the greatest lesson from this case. Justice is never achieved through one dramatic breakthrough. It is built patiently through hundreds of small observations, careful scientific analysis, and investigators who remain committed to following the evidence wherever it leads to. As we reach the final stage of this case study, I would like you to imagine something. Imagine that very same sequence of events occurred today rather than during the early 1970s. How different would the investigation be? The answer is in many ways completely different. Today, almost every person carries a mobile phone that constantly generates digital information. Every phone connects to nearby cell towers, creating location data that investigators can analyze with the appropriate legal authorization. GPS records, digital payments, CCTV footage, automatic number plate recognition systems, social media activity, and surveillance cameras all provide investigators with information that simply did not exist 50 years ago. Now imagine investigators receiving reports of several disappearances. Instead of relying only on handwritten reports and witness recollections, detectives could reconstruct timelines using digital evidence. They could identify the last mobile phone signal received from a missing person. They could examine CCTV footage from nearby routes, petrol stations, shopping centers, and university campuses. Vehicle movements could be compared across multiple locations, while investigators from different states could instantly share intelligence through national databases. Then there is DNA. During the 1970s, DNA profiling did not exist as an investigative tool. Detectives depended on fingerprints, blood typing, hair comparisons, fibers, witness statements, and traditional forensic methods. Today, even extremely small biological traces can provide investigators with valuable evidence. DNA databases have solved thousands of cases that remain unsolved for decades. Digital forensics has also transformed investigations. Modern investigators examine computers, mobile phones, cloud storage, emails, internet activity, navigation history, and digital communication. Every digital interaction can contribute another piece to the investigative puzzle. However, it would be a mistake to believe that technology solves crimes by itself. Technology provides information, investigators provide understanding. Every piece of digital evidence must still be collected legally. Every forensic examination must follow strict scientific protocols. Every witness statement must still be evaluated carefully. Every investigative theory must still be tested objectively. Technology makes investigations faster. It does not replace careful thinking. That is perhaps one of the greatest lessons this case teaches us. The most advanced forensic laboratory in the world is only as effective as the investigators interpreting its findings. When criminologists study famous investigations, they are not searching for dramatic stories, they are searching for lessons. This case leaves behind several that continue to influence criminal investigations today. The first lesson is the importance of communication. One of the greatest challenges investigators faced during the early stages of this case was the lack of coordination between police departments. Each agency possessed valuable pieces of information, yet no single department initially had access to complete the picture. Today, interagency cooperation is considered one of the foundations of effective policing. Information sharing saves time, information sharing prevents duplication of effort, and in many cases, information sharing saves lives. The second lesson is the importance of documentation. Every witness statements, every photograph, every fingerprint, every report, every sketch, and every observation. Individually, these may appear insignificant. Collectively, they become evidence. Good investigators understand that no observation is too small to document properly, because today's insignificant detail may become tomorrow's crucial breakthrough. The third lesson concerns behavioral observation. Behavior should never replace physical evidence. However, behavioral analysis often helps investigators ask better questions. Instead of assuming that two crimes are unrelated because they occurred in different locations, behavioral analysis encourages detectives to compare patterns. Sometimes those patterns reveal connections that physical evidence alone may not immediately explain. Another lesson is patience. Modern television often creates unrealistic expectations. Crime dramas frequently solve complicated investigation within a single episode. Real investigations are very different. Some require months, others require years. Justice is rarely fast, but careful investigations are far more valuable than rushed conclusions. Perhaps the greatest lesson of all, that criminal investigations are built upon teamwork. No detective works alone. Crime scene investigators preserve evidence. Forensic scientists analyze laboratory findings. Medical examiners determine the causes of death. Behavioral analysts identify recurring patterns. Prosecutors prepare legal cases. Laboratory technicians process evidence. Witnesses provide information. Each person contributes something essential and important. Justice is a collective effort, not an individual achievement. Before we conclude this investigation, let's evaluate the case using a forensic scorecard. This is not about judging the victims or glorifying the offender. Instead, it helps us understand the investigative challenges and educational significance of the case. Investigation difficulty 5 out of 5. Investigators face disappearances occurring across multiple jurisdictions without the benefit of modern technology. Communication between departments was limited, evidence was scattered, and recognizing patterns required extraordinary persistence. Behavioral complexity 5 out of 5. Understanding offender behavior became essential for connecting investigations that initially appeared unrelated. Behavioral analysis provide valuable direction while remaining grounded in observable evidence. Forensic technology available 2 out of 5. Compared with modern standards, investigators had relatively limited forensic resources. DNA profiling, digital evidence, CCTV networks, and national computerized databases were not yet available. Police coordination 2 out of 5. This case clearly demonstrated how fragmented investigations can delay recognition of serial offending. It also became one of the reasons why greater cooperation between agencies later became a priority. Educational value 5 out of 5. Very few criminal investigations have influenced criminology, behavioral science, investigation, and police training as profoundly as this one case. When viewed through the lens of education, this case becomes much more than a historical investigation. It becomes a classroom, one that continues teaching investigators nearly half a century later. As we come to the end of this case study, I want to leave you with final one thought. When most people hear the name Ted Bundy, they think of newspaper headlines, documentaries, and one of the most infamous criminal investigations in American history. But I hope after watching this analysis, you will remember something different. I hope you will remember the investigators who refused to stop searching despite enormous challenges. I hope you will remember the forensic scientists who worked with technology available to them and pushed the boundaries of criminal investigation. I hope you will remember the importance of victimology, behavioral science, evidence preservation, and interagency cooperation. And above all, I hope you will remember the victims not as statistics but as individuals whose lives mattered and whose loss led to improvements that continue to protect others today. The purpose of criminology is not to glorify crime. The purpose of forensic science is not to entertain. The purpose of both disciplines is to understand criminal behavior, improve investigations, support justice, and help prevent future victimization. Every investigation leaves behind more than evidence. It leaves behind experience. It leaves behind knowledge. It leaves behind lessons. And those lessons become the foundation upon which future investigators build a safer society. That is the true legacy of this case. If you found this documentary valuable and if it changed the way you think about criminal investigation, then you are in exactly the right place. This channel is not about sensationalizing crime or glorifying offenders. It's about understanding criminology, forensic science, investigative techniques, criminal psychology, and the science that helps uncover the truth. Every case we explore is an opportunity to learn how investigators think, how evidence is analyzed, and how justice evolves through knowledge. So, if that's the kind of content you enjoy, consider subscribing and becoming part of this growing community of curious mind. Also, let me know in the comments which case should we analyze next. Would you like to see the BTK killer, the Zodiac killer, the Green River killer, or the Night Stalker, or perhaps an unsolved mystery where modern forensic science might still provide answers? Your suggestion could become our next important case study. Until then, remember these words: crime leaves behind questions, investigation covers answers, but criminology ensures that every answer becomes a lesson for the future. Thank you for watching. Stay curious, stay critical, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next case analysis. Bye bye.